This past offseason, the trade market for all-star players went through the roof, where you had multiple teams trading numerous unprotected first-round picks for fringe-level all-stars, all-in type moves and mortgaging your future to start contending now. We've seen it before in NBA history, teams shelling out picks to get an established star for a chance to compete for a title, but never have we seen teams throwing around this many picks for non-superstar level players. It was unprecedented, but hey, the moves meant these teams would at least be competing for a championship, or at least building towards one, if not in the immediate future. Well, for all those teams, early returns have not been good, and each one of them saw early first round exits, and for the most part, not even really being competitive in their respective playoff series. You probably know which teams I'm talking about: the Timberwolves, the Hawks, and the Cavs, teams that made all-in moves this past offseason, exchanging multiple first round picks to compete now. All were eliminated in the first round of the playoffs, two of which had pretty underwhelming regular seasons as well. What happened, and what does this mean for the future of those teams going forward? If you're new to the channel and you like this type of content, be sure to subscribe for more NBA content like this. Now, when there was word going around the league that the San Antonio Spurs were looking to shop their all-star in Dejounte Murray, it surprised a lot of fans, as Murray was breaking out into the star player, entering his prime, who could play on both sides of the ball. Finding a legitimate two-way player who can run an offense with his court vision and also play heavy lockdown defense wasn't easy to come by. But when the Spurs pulled the trigger on trading Murray to the Hawks in exchange for Danilo Gallinari, who was really just salary filler, and 3 first-round picks, including a pick swap, 2 of the picks of which were unprotected, that transaction set the market for what an all-star player is worth in his prime. If you wanted to add a star player to your team, you better be ready to shell out picks to get them. That started the domino, which led to the Utah Jazz taking full advantage of and trading away their 2 all-star players in Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell. But what the Jazz received was even more insane, in that they were able to secure 5 first-round picks and 1 pick swap for Rudy Gobert, 3 of those being unprotected, the last of which in 2029 top 5 protected, and 3 first-round picks, all unprotected, as well as multiple pick swaps from the Cavs for Donovan Mitchell. Also included in that trade was Most Improved Player of the Year winner in Lauri Markkanen, rookie Ochai Agbaji, and Colin Sexton, all serviceable young players, one of which would ultimately become a first-time All-Star. All of that, though, for Donovan Mitchell. Now, to be fair, the Cavs by far had the better season over a team like the Hawks and the Timberwolves, and while maybe the trade was a bit lopsided when you consider the lack of playoff success that they've had thus far, and especially after seeing Lauri Markkanen break out into an all-star, the Cavs still have a very bright future, with their starting lineup still very young, athletic, super talented, and a balance of players that can play on both ends of the floor. A future with Donovan Mitchell, Darius Garland, Evan Mobley, Jarrett Allen is a team that is going to be very exciting to watch for the future, even though they crumbled in the playoffs despite having home court advantage. But with time, experience, building on the margins with role players, shooting, and depth off the bench, that should enable the Cavs to be competitive for the future, despite not having the draft capital to be able to build through the draft or use those picks as assets in the form of trades. The Wolves and the Hawks, on the other hand, yeah, not as good in terms of their overall future. The Timberwolves are considerably worse than the Hawks, mainly because they gave up more picks to get Gobert, and Gobert is older and less dynamic than someone like Murray, and I'll get to the Wolves in a little bit. But even for the Atlanta Hawks, a team that had that Cinderella-like run in 2021 where they went to the Western Conference Finals, took out the number 1 seeded Sixers in 6 games, they run it back with some minor tweaks the following season and finished 9th in the Eastern Conference. Needed the play-in to get into the playoffs and got bounced in the first round by the Heat. And for the Hawks, the biggest need going into the offseason was how do they build perimeter defense around Trae Young. They've got solid role players, they have size, shooting, but how do they get another star to pair alongside Trae Young? And they felt Dejounte Murray, who was breaking out into this star, this great defender, like Trae Young, also is a great facilitator and are also great at getting the basket and keeping up the pace of the overall flow of offense. So in theory, on paper, these two should be a great fit together, and the Hawks went all in trying to be the highest bidder for Dejounte Murray. The problem is, both Murray and Trae are both dominant guards who aren't as effective in playing off the ball. I'm not saying they can't play off the ball, but they're at their best when they've got the ball in their hands and running the offense. And you saw that in the numbers this season. Murray and his overall output wasn't as good. His numbers were down across the board, especially as it relates to his rebounding, passing. His overall efficiency on offense was okay, but honestly, something that I feel isn't talked about enough that was a big loss for the Atlanta Hawks was moving Kevin Huerter in a trade to the Kings. I know they received a first-round pick, which seems like a pretty big win when it's for a player like Kevin Huerter, but the loss of shooting and floor spacing for the Hawks by adding someone like Murray, who yes, can shoot threes, but not at a high clip and is more effective playing downhill and slashing to the basket. Sure, they still have Bogdanovic, but having another sharpshooter like Huerter is so key for their overall offense, and while Murray is clearly a better player and more valuable than Kevin Huerter, you can see it didn't really improve the team overall on both ends of the floor. They went second on offense to 7th in the league this season, and they marginally improved their overall defense, going from 26th on defense last year to 22nd this season. Their overall net rating went down from 14th to 18th in the league year over year. And you added an all-star. Yes, I know he wasn't selected as an all-star this season, but he was coming off an all-star season when he was traded. And when you look across the rest of the roster, unlike the Cavs, they're not as talented, they're not as young, and they have some guys that are already starting to look like they're on bad contracts. They gave DeAndre Hunter that big extension to his rookie deal where he's going to be paid through 2027, making near $25 million a year by the end of that contract. And I mean, Hunter is a decent player, but that's a hefty contract for just a rotational player. And then John Collins, who has drastically fallen off since his first couple of seasons in the league, he still has 3 years left on his deal with a player option on the last one. Capella still has 2 years left on his deal. The Hawks, as of right now, have $169 million guaranteed on their payroll for next season, which puts them over the cap. So they don't have money to sign free agents. They don't have draft picks to trade to bring in other players because they traded all those picks away to the Spurs. And they have some expensive, arguably bad contracts on their payroll that is going to be hard to get off the books. And of course, this doesn't even include the rumors surrounding Trae Young and his commitment to the organization, and whether the Hawks are going to eventually get to the point where they need to trade him if he forces his way out. And keep in mind, Dejounte Murray is eligible for an extension this offseason. He's going to be on an expiring deal. They have to re-sign him considering the investment they put into him by trading 3 first-round picks to get him. Just not good for the Hawks overall as it relates to their future. Not saying they're going to be a bad team, but I don't think anyone would consider them to be title contenders, and at this point are just stuck in a place of mediocrity. The Minnesota Timberwolves, though, I've talked about this before, but this is an absolute disaster of a situation that they find themselves in. I mean, the Rudy Gobert trade was bad enough. When you trade 5 first-round picks, one of which we already know is Walker Kessler, who was the top 3 Rookie of the Year candidate. 3 of the remaining 4 picks are unprotected, and with the way the future of this team is projecting, it's very possible those picks are going to be lottery bound. So for the Timberwolves, they don't have any draft capital to work with in terms of adding talent. They don't have the draft capital to work with in terms of using the picks as trade chips because they used all those trade chips to get Rudy Gobert, and their cap sheet is horrendous. No cap space for the foreseeable future. They're going to offer Anthony Edwards a big contract extension to his rookie deal because they have to. He's arguably their best player at this point. They extended Cat through 2028 on a max contract where he'll be getting paid $61 million on the final year of that deal. I said in a recent video that the Wolves' biggest problem, aside from the terrible management, is actually Karl Anthony Towns and that massive amount of money they have committed to him for the next 5 years. Cat is not that guy. He's a great player. No one is saying he's trash, but he's not a superstar franchise level player that you build around. He's too soft, isn't the best decision maker in late game situations, and while the thought was that you bring in someone like Gobert to help both Cat and Gobert complement each other's skills, specifically Karl Anthony Towns' lack of defense, his defense has gotten so bad in playing on and off the ball that he's almost become a liability on that end of the floor, getting in foul trouble, letting his defender blow by him, getting outworked in the post by other bigs. And even his offensive game has regressed a bit, not being as efficient shooting it from deep, which was one of Cat's biggest strengths in his ability to stretch the floor. Like the Hawks, the Timberwolves have very little cap space for now and for the future with big contracts they have locked up between Towns, Gobert, and soon-to-be Anthony Edwards. They have Mike Conley on the books for a partial guarantee next season. As of right now, they have $144 million guaranteed on their books for next year. Also, like the Hawks and the Cavs for that matter, the Wolves don't have draft picks both either to draft players for the future or to use said picks as trade assets. And look, it would be different if these teams were on a path to contention, or they just had lost in, say, the conference finals, or even just won a playoff series. And I do think the Cavs can get there because of their youth and overall talent pool. But for the Hawks and the Timberwolves, you're more or less pigeonholed yourself into a place where you're stuck in mediocrity and mortgage your future went all in to land yourself into mediocrity. Yes, they can get creative with trades potentially, but it won't be easy. And sure, yes, they could just blow everything up and go on a fire sale to rebuild and try and recoup all the draft capital they lost. But I have a hard time seeing that happening with the way these teams went about being aggressive and wanting to win and be relevant now. But you guys let me know what you think in the comments. As always, be sure to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.